Section 25 of Coningsby, or the New Generation, by Benjamin Disraeli. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 7, Chapter 3. The beautiful light of summer had never shone on a scene and surrounding landscape which recalled happier images of English nature, and better recollections of English manners, than that to which we would now introduce our readers. One of those true old English halls, now unhappily so rare, built in the time of the Tudors, and in its elaborate timber framing and decorative woodwork, indicating perhaps the scarcity of brick and stone at the period of its structure, as much as the grotesque genius of its fabricator, rose on a terrace surrounded by ancient and very formal gardens. The hall itself, during many generations, had been vigilantly and tastefully preserved by its proprietors. There was not a point which was not as fresh as if it had been renovated but yesterday. It stood a huge and strange blending of Grecian, Gothic, and Italian architecture, with a wild dash of the fantastic in addition. The lantern watch towers of a baronial castle were placed in juxtaposition with Doric columns employed for chimneys, while under oriel windows might be observed Italian doorways with Grecian pediments. Beyond the extensive gardens, an avenue of Spanish chestnuts at each point of the compass approached the mansion, or led into a small park which was table land, its limits opening on all sides to beautiful and extensive valleys, sparkling with cultivation, except at one point where the river Darl formed the boundary of the domain, and then spread in many a winding through the rich country beyond. Such was Hellingsley, the new home that Oswald Millbank was about to visit for the first time. Coningsby and himself had travelled together as far as Darlford, where their roads diverged, and they had separated with an engagement on the part of Coningsby to visit Hellingsley on the morrow. As they had travelled along, Coningsby had frequently led the conversation to domestic topics. Gradually he had talked, and talked much of Edith. Without an obtrusive curiosity, he extracted, unconsciously to his companion, traits of her character and early days which filled him with a wild and secret interest. The thought that in a few hours he was to meet her again infused into his being a degree of transport which the very necessity of repressing before his companion rendered more magical and thrilling. How often it happens in life that we have with a grave face to discourse of ordinary topics, while all the time our heart and memory are engrossed with some enchanting secret. The castle of his grandfather presented a far different scene on the arrival of Coningsby from that which it had offered on his first visit. The Marquess had given him a formal permission to repair to it at his pleasure, and had instructed the steward accordingly. But he came without notice at a season of the year when the absence of all sports made his arrival unexpected. The scattered and sauntering household roused themselves into action, and contemplated the conviction that it might be necessary to do some service for their wages. There was a stir in that vast sleepy castle. At last the steward was found, and came forward to welcome their young master, whose simple wants were limited to the rooms he had formerly occupied. Coningsby reached the castle a little before sunset, almost the same hour that he had arrived there more than 3 years ago. How much had happened in the interval! Coningsby had already lived long enough to find interest in pondering over the past. That past, too, must inevitably exercise a great influence over his present. He recalled his morning drive with his grandfather to the brink of that river which was the boundary between his own domain and Hellingsley. Who dwelt at Hellingsley now? Restless, excited, not insensible to the difficulties, perhaps the dangers of his position, yet full of an entrancing emotion in which all thoughts and feelings seemed to merge, Coningsby went forth into the fair gardens to muse over his love amid objects as beautiful. A rosy light hung over the rare shrubs and tall fantastic trees, while a rich yet darker tint suffused the distant woods. This euthanasia of the day exercises a strange influence on the hearts of those who love. Who has not felt it? Magical emotions that touch the immortal part. But for Coningsby, the mitigating hour that softens the heart made his spirit brave. Amid the ennobling sympathies of nature, the pursuits and purposes of worldly prudence and conventional advantage subsided into their essential nothingness. He willed to blend his life and fate with a being as beautiful as that nature that subdued him, and he felt in his own breast the intrinsic energies that in spite of all obstacles should mould such an imagination into reality. He descended the slopes, now growing dimmer in the fleeting light, into the park. The stillness was almost supernatural. The jocund sounds of the day had died, and the voices of the night had not commenced. His heart, too, was still. A sacred calm had succeeded to that distraction of emotion which had agitated him the whole day, while he had mused over his love and the infinite and insurmountable barriers that seemed to oppose his will. Now he felt one of those strong, groundless convictions that are the inspirations of passion, that all would yield to him as to one holding an enchanted wand. Onward he strolled. It seemed without purpose, yet always proceeding. A pale and then gleaming tint stole over the masses of mighty timber, and soon a glittering light flooded the lawns and glades. The moon was high in her summer heaven, and still Coningsby strolled on. He crossed the broad lawns, he traversed the bright glades. Amid the gleaming and shadowy woods he traced his prescient way. He came to the bank of a rushing river foaming in the moonlight, and wafting on its blue breast the shadow of 1,000 stars. "O river," he said, "that rollest to my mistress, bear her to my heart." Chapter 4. Lady Wallinger and Edith were together in the morning room of Hellingsley, the morrow after the arrival of Oswald. Edith was arranging flowers in a vase, while her aunt was embroidering a Spanish peasant in correct costume. The daughter of Millbank looked as bright and fragrant as the fair creations that surrounded her. Beautiful to watch her as she arranged their forms and composed their groups; to mark her eye glance with gratification at some happy combination of colour, or to listen to her delight as they wafted to her in gratitude their perfume. Oswald and Sir Joseph were surveying the stables. Mr. Millbank, who had been daily expected for the last week from the factories, had not yet arrived. "I must say he gained my heart from the first," said Lady Wallinger. "I wish the gardener would send us more roses," said Edith. "He is so very superior to any young man I ever met," continued Lady Wallinger. "I think we must have this vase entirely of roses. Don't you think so, aunt?" inquired the niece. "I am fond of roses," said Lady Wallinger. "What beautiful bouquets Mr. Coningsby gave us at Paris, Edith." "Beautiful!" "I must say I was very happy when I met Mr. Coningsby again at Cambridge," said Lady Wallinger. "It gave me much greater pleasure than seeing any of the colleges." "How delighted Oswald seems at having Mr. Coningsby for a companion again," said Edith. "And very naturally," said Lady Wallinger. "Oswald ought to deem himself fortunate in having such a friend. I am sure the kindness of Mr. Coningsby when we met him at Cambridge is what I shall never forget. But he always was my favourite from the first time I saw him at Paris. Do you know, Edith, I liked him best of all your admirers." "Oh no, aunt," said Edith, smiling. "Not more than Lord Beaumanoir. You forget your great favourite, Lord Beaumanoir." "But I did not know Mr. Coningsby at Rome," said Lady Wallinger. "I cannot agree that anybody is equal to Mr. Coningsby. I cannot tell you how pleased I am that he is our neighbour." As Lady Wallinger gave a finishing stroke to the jacket of her Andalusian, Edith, vividly blushing, yet speaking in a voice of affected calmness, said, "Here is Mr. Coningsby, aunt." And truly, at this moment, our hero might be discerned approaching the hall by one of the avenues, and in a few minutes there was a ringing at the hall bell, and then, after a short pause, the servants announced Mr. Coningsby and ushered him into the morning room. Edith was embarrassed. The frankness and the gaiety of her manner had deserted her. Coningsby was rather earnest than self-possessed. Each felt at first that the presence of Lady Wallinger was a relief. The ordinary topics of conversation were in sufficient plenty: reminiscences of Paris, impressions of Hellingsley, his visit to Oxford, Lady Wallinger's visit to Cambridge. In 10 minutes their voices seemed to sound to each other as they did in the Rue de Rivoli, and their mutual perplexity had in a great degree subsided. Oswald and Sir Joseph now entered the room, and the conversation became general. Hellingsley was the subject on which Coningsby dwelt. He was charmed with all that he had seen, wished to see more. Sir Joseph was quite prepared to accompany him, but Lady Wallinger, who seemed to read Coningsby's wishes in his eyes, proposed that the inspection should be general, and in the course of half an hour Coningsby was walking by the side of Edith, and sympathising with all the natural charms to which her quick taste and lively expression called his notice and appreciation. Few things more delightful than a country ramble with a sweet companion, exploring woods, wandering over green commons, loitering in shady lanes, resting on rural stiles, the air full of perfume, the heart full of bliss. It seemed to Coningsby that he had never been happy before. A thrilling joy pervaded his being. He could have sung like a bird. His heart was as sunny as the summer scene. Past and future were absorbed in the flowing hour, not an allusion to Paris, not a speculation on what might arrive, but infinite expressions of agreement, sympathy, a multitude of slight phrases that, however couched, had but one meaning: congeniality. He felt each moment his voice becoming more tender, his heart gushing in soft expressions. Each moment he was more fascinated. Her step was grace, her glance was beauty. Now she touched him by some phrase of sweet simplicity, or carried him spellbound by her airy merriment. Oswald assumed that Coningsby remained to dine with them. There was not even the ceremony of invitation. Coningsby could not but remember his dinner at Millbank, and the timid hostess whom he then addressed so often in vain, as he gazed upon the bewitching and accomplished woman whom he now passionately loved. It was a most agreeable dinner. Oswald, happy in his friend being his guest under his own roof, indulged in unwonted gaiety. The ladies withdrew. Sir Joseph began to talk politics, although the young men had threatened their fair companions immediately to follow them. This was the period of the bedchamber plot, when Sir Robert Peel accepted and resigned power in the course of 3 days. Sir Joseph, who had originally made up his mind to support a Conservative government when he deemed it inevitable, had for the last month endeavoured to compensate for this trifling error by vindicating the conduct of his friends and reprobating the behaviour of those who would deprive her Majesty of the friends of her youth. Sir Joseph was a most chivalrous companion of the friends of her youth principle. Sir Joseph, who was always moderate and conciliatory in his talk, though he would go at any time any lengths for his party, expressed himself to day with extreme sobriety, as he was determined not to hurt the feelings of Mr. Coningsby, and he principally confined himself to urging temperate questions, somewhat in the following fashion: 'I admit that, on the whole, under ordinary circumstances, it would have been more convenient that these appointments should have remained with Sir Robert. But don't you think that under the peculiar circumstances, being friends of her Majesty's youth,' etc., etc. Sir Joseph was extremely astonished when Coningsby replied that he thought under no circumstances should any appointment in the royal household be dependent on the voice of the House of Commons, though he was far from admiring the 'friends of her youth' principle, which he looked upon as impertinent. 'But surely,' said Sir Joseph, 'the minister being responsible to Parliament, it must follow that all great offices of state should be filled at his direction.' 'But where do you find this principle of ministerial responsibility?' inquired Coningsby. "And is not a minister responsible to his sovereign?" inquired Millbank. Sir Joseph seemed a little confused. He had always heard that ministers were responsible to Parliament, and he had a vague conviction, notwithstanding the reanimating loyalty of the Bedchamber plot, that the sovereign of England was a nonentity. He took refuge in indefinite expressions, and observed, "The responsibility of ministers is surely a constitutional doctrine." "The ministers of the Crown are responsible to their master. They are not the ministers of Parliament." "But then, you know, virtually," said Sir Joseph, "the Parliament, that is the House of Commons, governs the country." "It did before 1832," said Coningsby, "but that is all past now. We got rid of that with the Venetian Constitution." "The Venetian Constitution?" said Sir Joseph. "To be sure," said Millbank. "We were governed in this country by the Venetian Constitution from the accession of the House of Hanover. But that yoke is past. And now I hope we are in a state of transition from the Italian Dogeship to the English monarchy." "King, Lords, and Commons, the Venetian Constitution!" exclaimed Sir Joseph. "But they were phrases," said Coningsby, "not facts. The King was a Doge, the Cabinet the Council of Ten. Your Parliament that you call Lords and Commons was nothing more than the great council of nobles." "The resemblance was complete," said Millbank, "and no wonder, for it was not accidental. The Venetian Constitution was intentionally copied." "We should have had the Venetian Republic in 1640," said Coningsby, "had it not been for the Puritans. Geneva beat Venice." "I am sure these ideas are not very generally known," said Sir Joseph, bewildered. "Because you have had your history written by the Venetian party," said Coningsby, "and it has been their interest to conceal them." "I will venture to say that there are very few men on our side in the House of Commons," said Sir Joseph, "who are aware that they were born under a Venetian constitution." "Let us go to the ladies," said Millbank, smiling. Edith was reading a letter as they entered. "A letter from papa!" she exclaimed, looking at her brother with great animation. "We may expect him every day, and yet, alas! he cannot fix one." They now all spoke of Millbank, and Coningsby was happy that he was familiar with the scene. At length he ventured to say to Edith, "You once made me a promise which you have never fulfilled. I shall claim it to night." "And what can that be?" "The song that you promised me at Millbank more than 3 years ago." "Your memory is good." "It has dwelt upon the subject." Then they spoke for a while of other recollections, and then Coningsby appealing to Lady Wallinger for her influence, Edith rose and took up her guitar. Her voice was rich and sweet; the air she sang, gay, even fantastically frolic, such as the girls of Granada chant trooping home from some country festival. Her soft dark eye brightened with joyous sympathy, and ever and anon with an arch grace she beat the guitar in chorus with her pretty hand. The moon wanes, and Coningsby must leave these enchanted halls. Oswald walked homeward with him until he reached the domain of his grandfather. Then, mounting his horse, Coningsby bade his friend farewell till the morrow, and made his best way to the castle. Chapter 5. There is a romance in every life. The emblazoned page of Coningsby's existence was now open. It had been prosperous before, with some moments of excitement, some of delight; but they had all found, as it were, their origin in worldly considerations, or been inevitably mixed up with them. At Paris, for example, he loved, or thought he loved; but there not an hour could elapse without his meeting some person or hearing something which disturbed the beauty of his emotions or broke his spellbound thoughts. There was his grandfather hating the Millbanks, or Sidonia loving them; and common people in the common world making common observations on them, asking who they were, or telling who they were, and brushing the bloom off all life's fresh delicious fancies with their coarse handling. But now his feelings were ethereal. He loved passionately, and he loved in a scene and in a society as sweet, as pure, and as refined as his imagination and his heart. There was no malicious gossip, no callous chatter to profane his ear and desecrate his sentiment. All that he heard or saw was worthy of the summer sky, the still green woods, the gushing river, the gardens and terraces, the stately and fantastic dwellings, among which his life now glided as in some dainty and gorgeous masque. All the soft, social, domestic sympathies of his nature, which, however abundant, had never been cultivated, were developed by the life he was now leading. It was not merely that he lived in the constant presence and under the constant influence of one whom he adored, that made him so happy. He was surrounded by beings who found felicity in the interchange of kind feelings and kind words, in the cultivation of happy talents and refined tastes, and the enjoyment of a life which their own good sense and their own good hearts made them both comprehend and appreciate. Ambition lost much of its splendour, even his lofty aspirations something of their hallowing impulse of paramount duty, when Coningsby felt how much ennobling delight was consistent with the seclusion of a private station, and mused over an existence to be passed amid woods and waterfalls, with a fair hand locked in his, or surrounded by his friends in some ancestral hall. The morning after his first visit to Hellingsley, Coningsby rejoined his friends, as he had promised Oswald at their breakfast table, and day after day he came with the early sun, and left them only when the late moon silvered the keep of Coningsby Castle. Mr. Millbank, who wrote daily, and was daily to be expected, did not arrive. A week of unbroken bliss, had vanished away, passed in long rides and longer walks, sunset saunterings, and sometimes moonlit strolls, talking of flowers, and thinking of things even sweeter, listening to delicious songs, and sometimes reading aloud some bright romance or some inspiring lay. One day Coningsby, who arrived at the hall unexpectedly late, indeed it was some hours past noon, for he had been detained by despatches which arrived at the Castle from Mr. Rigby, and which required his interposition, found the ladies alone, and was told that Sir Joseph and Oswald were at the fishing cottage, where they wished him to join them. He was in no haste to do this, and Lady Wallinger proposed that when they felt inclined to ramble, they should all walk down to the fishing cottage together. So, seating himself by the side of Edith, who was tinting a sketch which she had made of a rich oriel of Hellingsley, the morning passed away in that slight and yet subtle talk in which a lover delights, and in which, while asking 1,000 questions that seem at the first glance sufficiently trifling, he is indeed often conveying a meaning that is not expressed or attempting to discover a feeling that is hidden. And these are occasions when glances meet and glances are withdrawn, the tongue may speak idly, the eye is more eloquent and often more true. Coningsby looked up. Lady Wallinger, who had more than once announced that she was going to put on her bonnet, was gone. Yet still he continued to talk trifles, and still Edith listened. 'Of all you have told me,' said Edith, 'nothing pleases me so much as your description of St. Geneviève. How much I should like to catch the deer at sunset on the heights! What a pretty drawing it would make!' 'You would like Eustace Lyle,' said Coningsby. 'He is so shy, and yet so ardent.' 'You have such a band of friends. Oswald was saying this morning that there was no one who had so many devoted friends.' 'We are all united by sympathy. It is the only bond of friendship, and yet friendship—' 'Edith,' said Lady Wallinger, looking into the room from the garden with her bonnet on, 'you will find me roaming on the terrace.' 'We come, dear aunt.' And yet they did not move. There were yet a few pencil touches to be given to the tinted sketch. Coningsby would cut the pencils. 'Would you give me,' he said, 'some slight memorial of Hellingsley and your art? I would not venture to hope for anything half so beautiful as this, but the slightest sketch, it would make me so happy when away to have it hanging in my room.' A blush suffused the cheek of Edith. She turned her head a little aside, as if she were arranging some drawings. and then she said, in a somewhat hushed and hesitating voice, "I am sure I will do so, and with pleasure. A view of the hall itself, I think that would be the best memorial. Where shall we take it from? We will decide in our walk?" And she rose, and promised immediately to return, left the room. Coningsby leant over the mantelpiece in deep abstraction, gazing vacantly on a miniature of the father of Edith. A light step roused him. She had returned. Unconsciously he greeted her with a glance of ineffable tenderness. They went forth. It was a grey, sultry day. Indeed, it was the covered sky which had led to the fishing scheme of the morning. Sir Joseph was an expert and accomplished angler, and the Darl was renowned for its sport. They lingered before they reached the terrace, where they were to find Lady Wallinger, observing the different points of view which the hall presented, and debating which was to form the subject of Coningsby's drawing; for already it was to be not merely a sketch, but a drawing, the most finished that the bright and effective pencil of Edith could achieve. If it really were to be placed in his room, and were to be a memorial of Hellingsley, her artistic reputation demanded a masterpiece. They reached the terrace. Lady Wallinger was not there, nor could they observe her in the vicinity. Coningsby was quite certain that she had gone onward to the fishing cottage, and expected them to follow her; and he convinced Edith of the justness of his opinion. To the fishing cottage, therefore, they bent their steps. They emerged from the gardens into the park, sauntering over the table land, and seeking as much as possible the shade in the soft but oppressive atmosphere. At the limit of the table land their course lay by a wild but winding path through a gradual and wooded declivity. While they were yet in this craggy and romantic woodland, the big fervent drops began to fall. Coningsby urged Edith to seek at once a natural shelter, but she, who knew the country, assured him that the fishing cottage was close by, and that they might reach it before the rain could do them any harm. And truly at this moment, emerging from the wood, they found themselves in the valley of the Darl. The river here was narrow and winding, but full of life; rushing and clear but for the dark sky it reflected, with high banks of turf and tall trees, the silver birch among all others in clustering groups, infinitely picturesque. At the turn of the river, about 200 yards distant, Coningsby observed the low dark roof of the fishing cottage on its banks. They descended from the woods to the margin of the stream by a flight of turfen steps, Coningsby holding Edith's hand as he guided her progress. The drops became thicker. They reached at a rapid pace the cottage. The absent boat indicated that Sir Joseph and Oswald were on the river. The cottage was an old building of rustic logs, with a shelving roof, so that you might obtain sufficient shelter without entering its walls. Coningsby found a rough garden seat for Edith. The shower was now violent. Nature, like man, sometimes weeps from gladness. It is the joy and tenderness of her heart that seek relief, and these are summer showers. In this instance the vehemence of her emotion was transient, though the tears kept stealing down her cheek for a long time, and gentle sighs and sobs might for some period be distinguished. The oppressive atmosphere had evaporated, the grey sullen tint had disappeared, a soft breeze came dancing up the stream, a glowing light fell upon the woods and waters, the perfume of trees and flowers and herbs floated around. There was a carolling of birds, a hum of happy insects in the air, freshness and stir, and a sense of joyous life pervaded all things. It seemed that the heart of all creation was opened. Coningsby, after repeatedly watching the shower with Edith, and speculating on its progress, which did not much annoy them, had seated himself on a log almost at her feet. And assuredly a maiden and a youth more beautiful and engaging had seldom met before in a scene more fresh and fair. Edith, on her rustic seat, watched the now blue and foaming river, and the birch trees with a livelier tint and quivering in the sunset air. An expression of tranquil bliss suffused her beautiful brow, and spoke from the thrilling tenderness of her soft dark eye. Coningsby gazed on that countenance with a glance of entranced rapture. His cheek was flushed, his eye gleamed with dazzling lustre. She turned her head, she met that glance, and troubled, she withdrew her own. 'Edith,' he said in a tone of tremulous passion, 'let me call you Edith. Yes,' he continued, gently taking her hand, 'let me call you my Edith. I love you.' She did not withdraw her hand, but turned away a face flushed as the impending twilight. Chapter VI. It was past the dinner hour when Edith and Coningsby reached the hall, an embarrassing circumstance, but mitigated by the conviction that they had not to encounter a very critical inspection. What then were their feelings when the first servant that they met informed them that Mr. Millbank had arrived? Edith could never have believed that the return of her beloved father to his home could ever have been to her other than a cause of delight. And yet now she trembled when she heard the announcement. The mysteries of love were fast involving her existence. But this was not the season of meditation. Her heart was still agitated by the tremulous admission that she responded to that fervent and adoring love whose eloquent music still sounded in her ear, and the pictures of whose fanciful devotion flitted over her agitated vision. Unconsciously she pressed the arm of Coningsby as the servant spoke, and then, without looking into his face, whispering him to be quick, she sprang away. As for Coningsby, notwithstanding the elation of his heart, and the ethereal joy which flowed in all his veins, the name of Mr. Millbank sounded something like a knell. However, this was not the time to reflect. He obeyed the hint of Edith, made the most rapid toilet that ever was consummated by a happy lover, and in a few minutes entered the drawing room of Hellingsley to encounter the gentleman whom he hoped by some means or other, quite inconceivable, might some day be transformed into his father-in-law, and the fulfilment of his consequent duties towards whom he had commenced by keeping him waiting for dinner. 'How do you do, sir?' said Mr. Millbank, extending his hand to Coningsby. 'You seem to have taken a long walk.' Coningsby looked round to the kind Lady Wallinger, and half addressed his murmured answer to her, explaining how they had lost her and their way, and were caught in a storm or a shower, which, as it terminated about 3 hours back, and the fishing cottage was little more than a mile from the hall, very satisfactorily accounted for their not being in time for dinner. Lady Wallinger then said something about the lowering clouds having frightened her from the terrace, and Sir Joseph and Oswald talked a little of their sport, and of their having seen an otter. But there was, or at least there seemed to Coningsby, a tone of general embarrassment which distressed him. The fact is, keeping people from dinner under any circumstances is distressing. They are obliged to talk at the very moment when they wish to use their powers of expression for a very different purpose. They are faint, and conversation makes them more exhausted. A gentleman, too, fond of his family, who in turn are devoted to him, making a great and inconvenient effort to reach them by dinner time, to please and surprise them, and finding them all dispersed, dinner so late that he might have reached home in good time without any great inconvenient effort; his daughter, whom he had wished 1,000 times to embrace, taking a singularly long ramble with no other companion than a young gentleman whom he did not exactly expect to see; all these are circumstances, individually perhaps slight, and yet, encountered collectively, it may be doubted that they would not a little ruffle even the sweetest temper. Mr. Millbank, too, had not the sweetest temper, though not a bad one; a little quick and fiery; but then he had a kind heart. And when Edith, who had providentially sent down a message to order dinner, entered and embraced him at the very moment that dinner was announced, her father forgot everything in his joy in seeing her, and his pleasure in being surrounded by his friends. He gave his hand to Lady Wallinger, and Sir Joseph led away his niece. Coningsby put his arm around the astonished neck of Oswald, as if they were once more in the playing fields of Eton. 'By Jove, my dear fellow,' he exclaimed, 'I am so sorry we kept your father from dinner.' As Edith headed her father's table, according to his rigid rule, Coningsby was on one side of her. They never spoke so little. Coningsby would have never unclosed his lips had he followed his humour. He was in a stupor of happiness. The dining room took the appearance of the fishing cottage, and he saw nothing but the flowing river. Lady Wallinger was, however, next to him, and that was a relief, for he felt always she was his friend. Sir Joseph, a good-hearted man, and on subjects with which he was acquainted full of sound sense, was invaluable to day, for he entirely kept up the conversation, speaking of things which greatly interested Mr. Millbank. And so their host soon recovered his good temper. He addressed several times his observations to Coningsby, and was careful to take wine with him. On the whole, affairs went on flowingly enough. The gentlemen, indeed, stayed much longer over their wine than on the preceding days, and Coningsby did not venture on the liberty of quitting the room before his host. It was as well. Edith required repose. She tried to seek it on the bosom of her aunt as she breathed to her the delicious secret of her life. When the gentlemen returned to the drawing room, the ladies were not there. This rather disturbed Mr. Millbank again. He had not seen enough of his daughter. He wished to hear her sing. But Edith managed to reappear, and even to sing. Then Coningsby went up to her and asked her to sing the Song of the Girls of Granada. She said in a low voice, and with a fond yet serious look, 'I am not in the mood for such a song, but if you wish me—' She sang it, and with inexpressible grace, and with an arch vivacity that to a fine observer would have singularly contrasted with the almost solemn and even troubled expression of her countenance a moment afterwards. The day was about to die; the day the most important, the most precious in the lives of Harry Coningsby and Edith Millbank. Words had been spoken, vows breathed, which were to influence their careers for ever. For them hereafter there was to be but one life, one destiny, one world. Each of them was still in such a state of tremulous excitement that neither had found time nor occasion to ponder over the mighty result. They both required solitude. They both longed to be alone. Coningsby rose to depart. He pressed the soft hand of Edith, and his glance spoke his soul. 'We shall see you at breakfast to morrow, Coningsby,' said Oswald very loud, knowing that the presence of his father would make Coningsby hesitate about coming. Edith's heart fluttered, but she said nothing. It was with delight she heard her father, after a moment's pause, say, 'Oh, I beg we may have that pleasure.' 'Not quite at so early an hour,' said Coningsby; 'but if you will permit me, I hope to have the pleasure of hearing from you to morrow, sir, that your journey has not fatigued you.' Chapter 7